Hey there, Jonathan Golko here. Welcome back to the sound booth at Studio 1405. We're reaching the end of our sonic journey through music production with an important part of the process, mastering. Mastering is the finishing touch on a recording. It's the final mix of the final mix. Mastering takes a well-balanced mix and makes final tweaks to the EQ levels, compression, and volume. It's the mastering engineer's job to make the track sound radio-friendly. That is, to have the overall volume level fit within the limits of a broadcasting service such as FM radios, streaming platforms like Spotify and YouTube, or when a record is physically cut into a vinyl record. Just like a mix's relationship to the recording, no amount of mastering can fix a bad mix. That makes it important for us as independent songwriters, mix engineers, and producers to be mindful that after all that work, there is still the mastering process to be considered. Now, technically, it's been said that the recording artist or the producer should not master their own mixes. The reason why is critical, but it's not forbidden knowledge that is unattainable. When employing a mastering engineer who has had no involvement in the recording or writing process, you're getting a totally fresh pair of ears. That is to say that they are completely objective to the recording. Objectivity is key to mastering. To separate the mind from artistic decisions like, is the snare drum loud enough? Is the bass guitar tone supposed to be crisp and clear or deep and punchy? Do the vocals sit well enough on top of the guitars? Those questions are better left to the songwriter, producer, and mix engineer. If we're in the mastering stage and one of those questions is in the way of accomplishing a proper mastering, then it would be advised to reopen the mix session and fix the track. In mastering, it's all about evaluating the overall musical work, the biggest of big pictures. Let's return to our Moonlight Sonata session one more time and review the process of prepping the mix for the mastering stage and briefly looking at how a mastering engineer may approach this track. Let's dive in. So we're going to pick up right where we left off in episode 3. We've got our loop here with the bass clarinet and the piano, and we had added all of these plugins. Where we left off was looking at this WLM loudness meter from Waves. And what we're going to do in the mastering is kind of begin with the ending and then work our way backwards. So what we're going to do is take a listen to this loop, and we're going to make an adjustment here to the loudness meter to pull this up to our target. So this is the idea that in mastering, what we want to get to that end goal is going to be hitting a certain target level volume that'll be appropriate for different platforms, however you wish to release your music. In this case, we're looking at YouTube and Spotify at -14 dB. We're going to take a listen to this loop. We're going to keep an eye on the master volume here, and we'll see how many decibels we need to increase this to reach our -10 sweet spot that we've been aiming for. We'll see that most of the music is going to be living here in the 20s, but we want to keep it up closer to 10. So as we adjust the gain here, keep an eye on this master volume, and you'll be able to hear our entire volume increase as we go through lifting this gain. Now be aware, this music is going to begin quiet, and as we raise the gain, the volume will be rising towards that target level of -14 that we're aiming for here for YouTube and Spotify. So don't be surprised if the music begins a bit quiet. We're going to be raising that volume to our target level, so be ready for that. So you see that we had this short-term reading moment to moment on terms of our volume levels, but the overall volume of this particular loop finally hit at that -14. And you may notice that the changes we made to the gain down here did not affect the VU meter because this effect happens afterwards. Everything we've done from here all the way through the submix went into the VU meter so that our volume was not peaking above 0, but then that extra volume, that perceived volume that we gave this here on the master fader actually came from this effect simply by lifting the entire gain of the track. So this would be our shortcut towards mastering. If we did all of the recording, all the editing, all the mixing, and we just wanted to get that track to that target level for YouTube and Spotify, we could use this plugin to get that volume set right away. Now, mastering engineers have many more tricks up their sleeve than just throwing on a simple loudness meter. So we're going to be digging into that, but before we do, I want to make a few final changes here in the mix. So I'm going to close this down. I'm going to pull the compressor down and add multi-channel plugin dynamics down at the bottom, vocal rider stereo. So what this effect does is it mimics a mixing technique called volume automation, where we would go through and literally change the volume levels using the mix window and this fader to automate the volume changes as it would reflect the bass clarinet's performance. So we would be using this technique if, for example, the bass clarinet's crescendo was a little bit too loud and we just needed to wrangle it in without making a huge change. We could just bring its volume down in that one moment. Now we have a plugin that can do some of that automatically for us, and this is what we're going to find in the vocal rider. So check this out. As we listen to this loop, I'm going to bypass the compressor by holding Command and clicking on the plugin. We're going to listen to the vocal rider now and watch as I make some changes here to the volume range as well as the target volume and sensitivity to get this bass clarinet's crescendos and decrescendos automated in terms of volume. Again, this is going to help the instrument sit very comfortably in with the piano. It's going to save us some time, and it's going to help our mastering because the instrument isn't going to have so many fluctuations in its dynamics. Okay, so we're seeing that we're getting a little bit of that dynamic range controlled here by this volume automator. Now let's bring our compressor back in. You may have noticed that we peaked a little bit with this plugin, but what we've got here in the compressor is a little bit more control. So now, keeping an eye on all of these, let's bring the compressor back in. So we'll unbypass that. We'll take a listen to this, and if we're still peaking here, we can make an adjustment down here at the gain on the compressor. Cool. So again, that's affecting the entire track, but we were seeing some of that crescendo encouraging that peaking. So we kept an eye on that by controlling it using this vocal rider volume automator in combination with the compressor that happened afterwards. So we can always keep an eye on that and control that here within the effects chain. Let's listen again and just make sure that our balance is set before we transition into mastering. I find that the low end on the piano is still a bit heavy. I want to make one final change before we bounce this mix and switch to our mastering session. So let's go back into the edit window here. Double click. I'm going to close down these plugins. Let's double click the piano. And what I'm going to do is holding Command and scrolling down. I want to focus on these low notes down here, the left hand. So hold Option, scroll up to zoom in. We want to take care of all of these notes down here. Again, they're a bit heavy-handed, and they're not necessarily hitting the same volume level as our upper tones. So what I'm going to do is take a broad highlight here. I'm going to go down to our velocity, and we're going to grab one of these tones, and we're going to just bring it down a few notches. So this is going to help control some of the attack we're getting from the low end of the piano. It's drowning out some of the upper register, and by lowering these bass tones here using the velocity, we're going to have a little bit more of an even balance sit across the board. Don't forget, we've also got that compressor going on in the effect chain, so that's also going to have an effect on these upper and lower range dynamics that are happening and be able to help control the overall piano performance. So we're going to hit the marker here so the music begins. I'm going to re-highlight these bass tones. We'll make a change in real time. Cool, so we've gotten a nice balance there. Let's get out of this window, Command W, double click up here at the edit so we get back to our mix window. And we want to talk about one more important aspect of this mix right before we bounce the entire track. Right now, we've been operating with the loudness meter on at its additional gain volume. Take a listen to the difference between the loudness meter being active and being bypassed. Now this is a huge change, and we want to make sure that when we're bouncing our music for mastering, we don't include this plugin. This is going to be added later, and keep in mind there's going to be extra effects added in terms of EQ, compression, limiters, and any other kind of stereo imaging or loudness meters. So we do want to make sure that we shut this off and keep this bypass when we do our final bounce as we send it to a mastering engineer. So to do that, we're going to go into our edit window again, double click, we'll close these out. We're going to make sure that we've selected the entirety of the track from beginning to end. And for the sake of this video, let's go to Grid. I'm going to hold Shift, and we're going to have this begin in measure 0. And when we create a new mastering session, we'll set the time code back to 54 beats per minute so that we can line these two sessions up with the same time code. It's going to make our job much easier in this case. We'll be able to add some of these markers back in as well so that we can keep track of where we are throughout the song. In highlighting this section and having both the piano and bass clarinet playing at the same time, we'll be able to hear this as its final stereo recording. Now we've got our click already bypassed, but just for good measure, we can get in the habit of muting that click so that that does not come through on our final bounce. The two options for bouncing will be to go to File, Bounce to Disk, or the short form of that is going to be Option, Command, and B on the Mac keyboard. This brings us to the bounce window. Bounce source, we want that to be output 1-2 stereo. We keep it. File type, WAV. We do not want to add an MP3. File format, interleaved. We want to make sure this is stereo. The bit depth is 24-bit. The sample rate is 48 kilohertz. That's the same settings that we had for this session. I want to keep those. We're not going to adjust any of these settings. And I'm going to go ahead and name this Mix for Master V1, version 1. And we're going to send it in the directory to the same folder that it's already plugged into. We're in our external hard drive with the Moonlight Sonata Summer Series. This goes directly into the Bounce Files folder. It does it automatically. You can manually send it wherever you like, but if you don't choose anything, it'll send it to the same Bounce file that exists within that folder. So we're all set here. We're going to hit Bounce. And now we're going to transition into the mastering part of the episode. We're going to open a new session in Pro Tools, and we're going to set it up very similar to what we've done here in the mix window in terms of auxiliary channels that'll contain an EQ, a compressor, and a limiter, all running through a submix that'll go into a master. But we're going to have two tracks of the same audio here that we're going to work with. One will be a reference of the raw mixed audio, and another one will be the one that we're going to process. So we'll be able to A/B them back and forth. A mastering engineer would then have other references, either from their own palette of music that they like, or songs specific to their client to kind of get the EQ, color, and general compression of a track. We use these references to make our music sound close to that which we admire. So now we're going to switch to our next session here by closing down this part of the tutorial and opening up a new session for mastering. We're into the mastering session now. We've named this Mastering V1. You can see our layout is very similar to what we had going on the mix. I've set up the session so that we're already plug and play. We've got our reference mix, which is the raw audio. We've got our processed, which is going to be the same reference mix but running through all of these effects channels. We see its output going to this bus that's EQ, this auxiliary channel here. This input of EQ goes to the output of compression, goes to the output of limiter, goes to the output of submix, that goes to the master. We'll notice the same familiar VU meter, and we've got the loudness meter down here too. Right now I've got all of these effects bypassed. We'll listen to the track and add them one at a time and change the dynamic level piece by piece. But first let's take a listen to our reference track with no effects running through no loudness meter. This is the raw audio from our mix with a new section we have looped. Let's take a listen to that now. So it's very soft, but this again was sitting from where it came in the mix. We're in a new session here. Now we're going to go to our process channel and let's start adding some of these effects. We're going to go in order in terms of going from EQ to compression to limiter to that final stage of loudness meter. Now, different mastering engineers have different approaches that they like to use. Some like to go this order of EQ, compression, limiter, and any kind of stereo imaging or loudness at the end, and others like to do it in the reverse, and they like to hear that big sound first and then work their way through adjusting some of the compression and EQ aspects of it once they've gotten that volume set. In this exercise, let's go ahead and start here by going from EQ into compression into limiter, and then do any kind of final volume adjustment we need to do down here with the gain. Now again, I've already got all of these presets, so that what you'll see here is we want to make sure we maintain that 0 as a peak on the VU meter, and then again, any volume that we didn't have coming through here in the overall volume level, we'll have that final gain adjustment happening right here. So now let's take a listen to our processed, and I'll start adding these plugins in one by one, and then we'll talk through how some of them are really making an effect on the overall audio performance of this track. So you could see that as we've added all of these various effects, we were able to lift the overall volume as well as change some of the color that's happening to the entire track. Let's go through these plugins one at a time now and talk really quickly about how each one was having a small and subtle effect, but how they all added up to this overall perceived volume and final sonic performance. I'm going to close down each one, and we'll start by adding them back in as we take a look at how these effects came into play. I also want to bring in another resource from mastering.com. These are experts in the mastering field, and they also offer courses that you can take if this is a subject that interests you. We're going to take a look here at the sonic spectrum again, which we saw from Musician on a Mission. This is mastering.com's version of it. Of course, it's going to have a lot of the same material because this is the science of audio. So we made some adjustments in our last session because the clarinet's piercingness, it had this harshness, and we made that dip in our EQ right here between 1 and 5K. Now, what we see here in our first plugin, I went with a simple EQ 3/7 band again. But what we ended up using here was a high pass filter and a low pass filter. We had the high pass here to help lower some of these extraneous frequencies that are coming in from the upper range. So some of that rumble tone or some boominess that may come from the low end of the piano in particular. We're going to have a filter here that's going to smooth out some of those frequencies so that they don't rumble through the track and that they'll be very passive underneath. Now on the other side, we have the low pass filter, which is actually putting a little bit of a sonic curve on some of this higher end, some of that brightness or some of the hissiness, the airiness that could come through the tone. So when we listened to the track from the beginning and we were just adding them in, you could hear the difference between this level of full frequency and then just a little bit of shaping, a little bit of smoothing off to that sound. And what we did here was essentially another move in subtractive or reductive EQ. Just like we did in that first step for the clarinet, before we boosted any frequency, we lowered some of them. So what we did to this entire track in terms of both the piano and the bass clarinet happening at the same time was we put this little bit of a coat on it. We put a blanket around the shoulders that just brought some of the low end and the high end frequencies in a little bit so that they're not so present and they don't get in the way or clutter up some of these other beautiful frequencies that we have happening right here in the center. Now right under that, we have the vitamin. This is another EQ that has a bit of compression built into it as well. Now the trick here in mastering is small movements. They may use several plugins in the course of their mastering or even back in a mixing session, but what we find is small adjustments actually have a much bigger impact over time rather than doing all of the work on one plugin. Spread them out. Each plugin's got a different sound, a little different taste. We can add those all together by making small movements. And you'll see that I made just a small bell curve. We made a boost. This is an EQ boost happening at about 500. 500 hertz is where we're getting this warm and natural sound. So after doing a reduction on the low end and the high end, I ended up putting a little bit of boost back here in the warm and natural tones. Next up, we brought in our compressor. This is a multi-band compressor, and the way it works is that it actually compresses frequency range, just as we're starting to see how it works here. So where each one of these divides happens, this compressor is affecting that frequency range. So to help tame some of that low end, I made this part of the filter a bit wider so it bled into 250 hertz, which did start to get into our fullness, but then again, I have a little bit of a boost right back here at 500, here in the punchy, full, natural, warm, fat sound. We wanted to bring out some of that color in the bass clarinet and the piano. It's just this really full-bodied sound. Here next to that, we have our upper range. We have the upper frequencies. And I kept that pretty close and level with just a little bit of a gain dip there. And then the high end, I did bring that up, even though we had this low-pass filter cutting out some of those higher frequencies. I did bring them back a little bit so that the overall tonality wasn't necessarily deadened, but it did have a little bit of action coming through. Again, by using a multi-band compressor, this actually allows us to control the threshold of that frequency range. And what this does is just in the same way the compressor controls the dynamics of an instrument, this does it to the entire track, but it does it within a frequency range. So we're able to control how much of that hits over the threshold. Now, I'm going to go ahead and play the track, and what we'll see out of this multi-band compressor is that you can actually see a visualization in real time of where these frequencies are hitting in this plugin. Take a listen. So this is a great way to reference where your volumes are hitting and looking at it from a visual standpoint and not one that is perceptionally aural. And now let's look at our limiter. This is very similar to this balance we were getting between the submix's volume going into the master and then that final volume that we got from the loudness meter. Let's take a listen and go back and forth between working with this threshold and the ceiling. You'll see that I went with a negative 10.5 dB and a negative 10 on the output ceiling. Let's just play around with this for a moment so you can hear how drastically different it is from having zero effect and working this back in. So you can see that those adjustments to the threshold and the output ceiling brought our track's volume higher, but also was able to control its highest peaking volume level. And this gave us a lot of control over that complete dynamic of the recording. Now there's another aspect of this limiter that we use that was specific to classical music. So when we're putting compressors on classical, which may not be necessary to do, we do find that we use a longer release time. This way the track doesn't have a pumping feel. That's going to be appropriate for EDM and hip-hop and pop music where we want that beat to really drive. But in classical, we want it to breathe. We want that compression to have a little bit more life and dynamic range and not be hitting too harshly and overdriving the music. We want it to have a nice breathing feel to it. And that's why we're going to be using a longer release time. Of course, we can get up to 1,000 milliseconds, but right now I'm looking at something around 47 here for this case. It seemed to have a nice drive. Now again, in this particular arrangement, we did keep the mix a little closer to a pop mix than we would necessarily a full-on classical mix. Because everything is so close and intimate, I'll make sure we have a little bit faster of a release time so that it does keep a little bit of that energy and just a touch of that punch. And then we looked at our last plugin, that was our loudness meter. And right now, let's take another listen. We can hit the reset button so all the volume metering is set back to its original state. We'll take a listen to this loop again and see where this is hitting. We'll go ahead and bypass it and turn it back on so that we can hear that great volume adjustment between having that loudness meter on and off and how it affects the entire volume of the track here in the master. Again, keep an eye on that VU meter. As we add this volume back in, we should not see a change in our overall peaks. So this gave us our target of 14. Now when using this plugin in real application, you want to play it across your entire track. You want that long term of -14 to be the entire track's long-term record. We've been practicing this with the loop just to show how to hit that target. But again, when you do this with your final music, you want to make sure you get that entire track hitting at -14 and not just the loudest part of your music. Let's take a final listen and A-B these two so we can hear what our process sounds against where we started. Here is our mastered version. And here's our reference that we started with. So you can see that the work we've done here by adding just a few plugins with very small adjustments ended up making a huge impact on the overall sound. Now we did lay into this loudness meter and boost this by 9.5 decibels, and we could have kept going on with other limiters or compressors to boost those frequencies and eventually get us to that target as well. But in a very brief and shallow version of mastering, this is an excellent place to start, and we got a drastically different dynamic performance between our reference mix and our final master. So we're ready to bounce this to its final form. We can highlight the song, and let's go ahead and zoom in. We're going to catch this right at the beginning. We keep that muted. We're just going to be doing our processed audio. And to do this final bounce, again, we go Option, Command, hit B. We're back at the bounce window here. We want to go with bounce source, output 1, 2 for stereo. File type, we'll keep it as WAV. We could add an MP3 at this point if we wanted. We're going to keep that file format as interleave so it's stereo. Now we're going to make a change to the bit depth and sample rate. For a final master, we want to bounce this out to 16-bit and 44.1 kilohertz. Now for file name, of course you can name it whatever you like. We're going to call this Moonlight Sonata Studio 1405 Mastered. We're going to send it to the same folder, that bounce files folder that happens within its own directory, and we would go ahead and hit bounce. Okay, we made it. Now that we've dialed in our sound and have finalized our song, we're ready to switch our creative gears from the personal art of making music to the public art of marketing. When it comes to displaying and marketing your art, think of it like an artist of the theater and stage. In theatrical psychology, we encounter a term referred to as the suspension of disbelief. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines this idiom as allowing oneself to believe that something is true even though it seems impossible. It's an actor's job to take an idea, characterize it in a way that is relatable to a wide or specific audience, and to connect the viewer with the performance in a way that establishes an emotional, inner relationship with that alternate reality. Here's how it works. Since the advent of human civilization some 2.5 to 3 million years ago, our ancestors have been telling stories. The art of communication is a defining trait of humanity. Using communication, humankind has built empires, driven select species to extinction, and developed digital tools that allow us to converse and share our experiences across the globe in the mere push of a finger. Trading information, collaborating on ideas, and sharing our thoughts with other like-minded people is a hallmark obsession of the human race. Simply put, more than anything on this planet, we love to tell stories and listen to them. Beyond making a recording, it's time to take our story of Moonlight Sonata to the next level. 40 years ago, in 1981, the first official music video was released on a new television channel called MTV. The song was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the London-based duo The Buggles. Not only was this title prophetic in nature as a music video, but also as an industry-shifting and culturally progressive moment that was clairvoyantly coordinated by MTV's marketing team. Today, we now live in a world where a recorded song, without a video attached, just doesn't have the legs to stand and compete in modern markets. So, our job as independent composers, arrangers, recording artists, mix or mastering engineers doesn't necessarily end when the music is exported as an audio file, CD, or is cut to vinyl. As a musical artist, marketing may not have the sparkle or magic that performing or listening to music may possess, but in truth, it is no less creative than a traditional artistic work, and it contains just as much science, strategy, and craftsmanship. For a song to succeed beyond the speakers of our own studios, we must rely on the methods of marketing to share our stories far and wide. These days, without a visual image and a dash of storytelling, a sound by itself cannot cement itself in our physical reality. In order to encourage our audience to jump on a streaming platform and listen to our recorded work, we're going to create a short 15-second music video teaser using footage from our Moonlight Sonata sessions. Over the next several episodes, we'll switch from Pro Tools audio software and move on to Adobe Premiere, Adobe Illustrator, and some other social media platforms, such as YouTube and Facebook, to take a shallow dive into the deep waters of creative marketing. We'll look at the basic processes of creating a short music video, generating album art in under 5 minutes, uploading and branding that video on YouTube, and finally posting that link on Facebook. Think of it as snorkeling along the reefs of storytelling, admiring the vibrant ecosystem of entertainment, and discovering a few core methods that allow you, as an artist, to connect with your audience and tell your story, and to take the initial steps to becoming a complete, universal artist of the modern world. Until next time, I've been Jonathan. Keep creating.